Okay, good morning, everybody. As Bill said, my name is Rob Penczak. I'm a physician turned writer turned secular activist, which basically means I've navigated my way to the bottom of the economic totem pole, and my wife probably should have been more careful in selecting her mate. At the risk of dating myself, I want to go back to the original Star Trek and borrow a line from the ship's doctor, Leonard McCoy. And I want to acknowledge that I'm not a climate scientist, I'm not a historian, I'm not an economist. I'm not really claiming any special expertise on a lot of things I want to be talking about. I'm just a humanist with an appreciation for science and critical thinking who feels that we really should do our best to improve the world. Now, I imagine this was a more memorable experience for me than it was for Professor Dawkins. I actually had the chance to meet him a few years ago when he was heading to DC as part of a book tour, and he took a side trip to our public access studio in Fairfax to do an episode of Road to Reason. A couple of my friends did the actual interview, but I called in to tell Dr. Dawkins that I plagiarized his work at every opportunity I got because I really loved the power of his metaphors and where they could take us. They could bring us climbing up the gentler than expected slopes of Mount Improbable to get to the summit, where we could then unweave the rainbow at its top, not to destroy its beauty, but to appreciate and understand it. And then we could ride the river out of Eden and out of ignorance with that newfound sort of appreciation for science and reason. I want to contrast that to the story of the fall of Icarus, where the father Daedalus uses his ingenuity and wit to design wings to help himself and his son so they can escape their tower on the island of Crete. The boy then in his exuberance flies too high, the sun melts the wax, and he falls to his death in the sea. This is sometimes read as a rebuke toward anybody who has the hubris to try to rise that high and challenge the gods. And it's a very different message than the one Richard Dawkins gives us in saying, let's try to learn, let's try to understand everything we can. Now, that's not to say that myths and images aren't really powerful. They do, and they stay with you. I think that probably relates to a point from the late Stephen Jay Gould, a paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, and science historian, who said people are storytelling creatures, and we like stories that go somewhere. So we'll discuss Dr. Gould's thoughts on non-overlapping magisteria later, but regarding stories, I think he had it just right. Because whether it's epic poems, a well-crafted metaphor, or carefully manufactured propaganda, our brains prove fertile grounds for receiving stories that take us places. We love to build stories, we love to tell them, we love to hear them. Some people even still like to read, just not Americans. I'm one, I can say that. And beyond any pleasure that stories might provide, psychologist Robin Dawes suggests that stories have become so integral to how humans think that our cognitive capacity shuts down in the absence of story. So in defense of our cognitive capacity, I want to start with a story. Now, hopefully this will be a useful story that takes us somewhere. And if it sounds a little bit contrived, or if it seems to actually fly in the face of the truth, as Sean Spicer or his body double might say, don't blame me, I'm just the messenger, just telling you what happened. So, just over a year ago, on the 1st of May, May Day more properly, or Beltane as the ancient Celts called it, Lawrence Krauss made the fateful decision to spend his morning Skyping with a band of infidels. Now, as any competent Druid or Wiccan could tell you, May Day is what's called a cross-quarter day because it falls between the vernal equinox and Midsummer's Eve. And as such, May Day carries with it a certain potency. For May Day is a liminal time when the boundary between the worlds grows porous. And that elusive quantum consciousness that's long been the physicist's holy grail can sometimes dribble through into the physical realm and grant us a glimpse of the future. Now, Dr. Krauss was probably reasonably dubious when we first explained this to him. He said, sure, looking backward is entirely possible. I can glance at the sun, I go back 8 minutes. If I want to go further, I look at a distant galaxy. That's easy. But peering into the future is different. So Dr. Krauss was reluctant to jettison a career studying physics for a fortune teller's crystal ball. Nonetheless, being the amiable sort of person that he is, and leveraged with the promise of his own starship, since he's written a few books on that, he eventually agreed to play along. And much to his surprise, the quantum consciousness did exactly what we'd hoped and treated him to a vision of the future. And what a vision it was, for this world that he spied had seen rashness yield to reason and corporate interest to the public good. Countries the world over had even dropped their nationalist boasting, and a truly global society had been forged. It was a world, aside from the starship, very much like the one that Yoko Ono and John Lennon had imagined 50 years earlier, the one that inspired this very conference. It was a world in which it was no longer in vogue to simply accumulate wealth, and in which religion and other virulent ideologies no longer held sway. Sadly, though, that vision soon dissipated. And before we get to Dr. Krauss's subsequent vision, I want to spend a few minutes talking about imagination, which is connected to the stories that we internalize and the things that we hold dear, and the narratives that we choose to live by, which in turn influence what we do with our lives. So the fact that we can imagine counterfactual worlds is a testament to the power of our imagination. But more impressive still is the fact that language, coupled with our highly evolved theory of mind, makes it possible for millions of strangers to imagine the very same world that John Lennon described, and to imagine it so vividly that they can actually understand why he found solace in it. And they can even go and rummage about that world for themselves if they'd like. All of this based on a few poetic stanzas. Now, even more striking is despite all of our science-based advances, despite heart transplants and gene editing, global interconnectivity at the flip of a phone, there are nonetheless still several billion people that are so wedded to their conflicting religious ideas that if you tell them about a world without magic, they're going to assume it's an atheistic fairy tale. Depressingly, this puts the truth to an Orwellian lie that Karl Rove used back in 2004 when he ridiculed the journalist Ron Suskind as a member of the reality-based community, which believed in the foolish notion that solutions emerged from the judicious study of discernible reality. Now, assumedly, that's a community that all of us want to be a part of. But Rove went on to explain, that's not the way the world really works anymore. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously as you will, we'll act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do. Now that leaves us with a dilemma, because on the one hand, Rove couldn't possibly have been more wrong, right? All animals cannot be equal if some are more equal than others, as Orwell put it. Speaking a lie doesn't convert it into a truth. But if a lie is useful, and if that lie is constructed in secret, where people don't see what's happening, and then it's adorned with the veneer of plausibility, then it's an entirely different matter. And as a lot of authors have said, so this reference to many different people, so I don't have one to attribute, a lie can get halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to get its boots on. And with the internet, it's worse than ever. You can look at the anti-vaccination movement, see a very good example of that. It's very hard to reel a lie back in once it's been released. Yuval Harari is an Israeli history professor and the author of *Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind*. I've only made it through the first few CDs of that, and I've read a little bit online, but he basically suggests that humankind's robust imagination, blossoming with the cognitive revolution 70,000 years BC, is what ultimately allowed our species to take over the world. Specifically, Harari points to our ability to share fictional constructs in our common imagination. These can be good gods, nations, money, human rights, and our belief gives these abstractions structure and value, which in turn allows us to organize ourselves around them. So money was completely worthless until we collectively decided that it was worth something, at which point money became worth everything, and we build our societies around it. Harari suggests that this sharing helped humans evolve the ability to cooperate together en masse towards shared goals, be that community defense or community aggression. This eventually made it irrelevant whether a human or a tiger would win in a solo fight, and in short order, humans went from being middling prey to the top predator on the planet. All this on account of our imagination and predilection for sharing community beliefs. Queensland psychologist Thomas Suddendorf puts a lot of stock in the imagination as well. He says that the gap that separates us from the other animals boils down to just two things: our imaginations and having friends with imaginations. More specifically, Suddendorf notes that when it comes to some of the features people generally think of as setting humans apart, things like language, intelligence, and morality, those are actually shared by other species at a rudimentary level. So in his opinion, what really differentiates us is A, our open-ended ability to imagine and reflect on different situations, and our deep-seated drive to link our scenario-building minds together. So again, we're natural-born storytellers who like to share our tales. Here's one of Donald Trump's kids sharing his tale. I put this picture in, and the other with a second kill, just to remind us that we're not all on the same wavelength when it comes to a humanist ethos. And it's a mistake for us to assume that everybody is and to behave that way. So returning to our initial story about Dr. Krause's May Day dabblings, no sooner had his first vision faded than a darker one came into view. In this one, the megalomaniacal Donald Trump had actually managed to bluster and bludgeon his way straight into the White House. While he and his flip-floppy never-Trumpers were busy walling out Mexican rapists and defending toilets against transgender abominations and stripping millions of people of the right to vote on the pretense of fighting voter fraud, this would all be laughable if it wasn't true. But while America focused on this bold new conservative agenda, it failed to notice that climate change had spiraled out of control. And the next thing they knew, the only thing standing between humanity and annihilation was Ken Ham's coal-powered, taxpayer-funded, biblically blueprinted ark. And sure, this vision did get some of the details wrong. Trump brought on Mike Pence, for instance, instead of reconciling with Ted Cruz. But on the whole, this May Day vision, which had been spied half a year before the actual election, was pretty accurate. This speaks to something that Einstein said, which is that the imagination is everything. It's the preview of life's coming attractions. So with the imagination, we really can look into the future. Just may not be that accurate, but we can foresee things that might come and take acts or don't act to avoid those. If you will notice in the bottom corner of that picture, there's a young girl calling back to Dr. Krause through a crack in time, calling back to all of us really, asking if we'd done everything in our power to steer our planet from such an abysmal future. And that's the main question I'd like us to address today. Are our communities, primarily meaning the secular, skeptical, atheist, scientific, and humanist ones, are we doing everything we can to maximize the potential for having a good future while minimizing the risk of a dismal one? And if not, why not? And what do we intend to do about it? And even though those were just made up stories, there's no utopia standing on the horizon, there's no girl peering back through a crack in time, there are literally billions of people who are currently alive and potentially countless billions more to follow depending how we navigate our crises, where it will matter what we do. Howard Zinn is author of The People's History of the United States. He was a historian, social activist, and political science professor. And the title of his work here is really crucial. You can't be neutral on a moving train, because when things are in motion, choosing not to do something means you're supporting the status quo. You are making a decision by not doing something. Now, before we get any further along, I want to thank everybody here for coming out instead of being home curled up in bed. We really do appreciate it. I also want to say that I'm completely humbled by a lot of the speakers we're going to be hearing from later today and tomorrow, who are consistently working to improve a society. And so I'm just happy to be part of it and appreciate all the work you guys do. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Bill and Kathy Lidgertwood for the invitation and for all of the organizational work that they do behind the scenes to make this possible. Now, I've had several friends tell me that Imagine No Religion conferences are always great. And I have no doubt that with this little bit of clip art and some cosmetic surgery, we can make INR great again. And to that end, I am bringing my best words so we can talk about a ton of great things. We're going to go from great expectations, because Bernie Sanders really embraced a lot of humanist values. In Creating Change Through Humanism, Royce Beckhardt points out the following pillars of humanism: an unflagging dedication to the scientific method, empathy, which allows us to recognize and share feelings experienced by others, and this leads to a deep-seated compassion for humankind and the world at large. And finally, an egalitarian-based sense of fairness. So those are what he sets out as pillars of humanism. A lot of people who felt the burn are probably humanists, even if they're not familiar with the term. And although it would have been nice if Sanders came out as an atheist, his conception of God as meaning we're all in this together, that went down pretty smoothly for a lot of us. And his suggestions of universal health care, free and affordable college, a living wage, that went down really well with a whole lot of America. Which is why it was so disappointing when Sanders was largely panned by the so-called liberal media, which worked with the DNC to thumb their nose at the true progressive they always seemed to dream about until we actually had a chance to elect one. Still, Hillary Clinton is eminently qualified. There's no comparison between her and somebody like Trump. And the Great Depression and stunned belief that descended over much of America and certainly throughout the activist community, my wife and I remember watching the election results, and it felt like 9/11, just that sinking feeling of what on earth are we doing? And this is going to have an impact for generations. And given a lot of problems that we're facing, I point out, maybe permanently for our species. So I want to start off by talking about some challenges that we're facing or that we're not facing. We'll start with climate change. So the question is, which of these sentiments best approximate America's official stance on climate change? Do we see it as A, the greatest challenge of our species, as conservation biologist and godfather of biodiversity Thomas Lovejoy said? Do we see it as the greatest challenge of our time, like Thomas Stocker, the then co-chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, said? Do we see it as the greatest threat to future generations, as President Barack Obama said in his 2015 State of the Union? Or do we see it as the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people, as says James Inhofe, evangelical senator from Oklahoma and climate-denying leader of the Environmental and Public Works Committee? Now, the fact that the correct answer is the one that's scientifically indefensible, and the fact that many of you probably aren't even slightly surprised to see the U.S. turning its back on science, that says an awful lot about politics in America. And it brings us right back to Karl Rove's dismissive attitude toward the reality-based community. In related news, on Thursday, just a couple days ago, Donald Trump officially announced that he's pulling the United States out of the landmark Paris Climate Accord, standing us beside Syria and Nicaragua as the only non-signatories, at which Elon Musk resigned from the White House Advisory Board. Was? He's staying? No, I'm saying he resigned over that. Yes. As for James Inhofe, who provided answer D, and we'll accept, Donald Trump's Chinese hoax is a good answer also. But for James Inhofe, he famously brought a snowball to the Senate floor in February of 2015, holding it out as proof perfect that he'd been right all along about the hoax of climate change. And we need to remember the power of stories even when the facts are wrong, right? When he holds up that snowball and says, there's no climate change. Look, we've got this since, late February. That sticks with people. So even if you're selling alternative facts like him, the fact that he received a couple $1 million from the oil industry, that doesn't make it into the story. A lot of people don't know that, and they just absorb what he said. Ironically, snowball notwithstanding, 2015 turned out to be the hottest year in recorded history, beating out 2014, which had previously been the hottest, and then 2016 rolled around, and that superseded them both. So as you can see here on the chart, the 10 warmest years in history are all in the last couple of decades, yet still the denialism goes on. And we could say a lot more about climate change. It stands to make resources scarce and trigger wars, to displace tens to hundreds of millions of people, to bring a host of infectious diseases to virgin populations that will have no immunity against incoming microbes. And you can read Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel to get a feel for how terribly that can go. Moving on to other problems, though, in keeping with our greatness theme. A decade ago, evolutionary biologist Jerry Coyne and Hopi Hoekstra wrote an article for the New Republic called The Greatest Dying, a Fate Worse Than Global Warming. In it, they went back roughly 250 million years to the Permian extinction. This was the greatest mass extinction that Earth's creatures had ever endured, with over 90% of species, perhaps up to 96%, being wiped out. And keep in mind that for a species to go extinct, if there's 2 billion members and 1.5 billion are wiped out, and those 500 million left, make it through, you lost 1.5 billion life forms, but the species still counts. I mean, to get up to that threshold of 90 or 96% of the species being wiped out is just a horrific death toll of individuals. Now, great mass extinctions, defined as 75% or more of species going extinct in a relatively short period, geologically speaking, are extremely rare events. On the order, there are 5 of them since we've had multicellular life, making it a 1 in 100 million year event. Coyne, Hoekstra, and the majority of biologists, however, have been warning us for some time that in our fleetingly short time on Earth, humanity has now marched the biosphere into extinction number 6. There's even a work group pressing to end the Holocene and start a new epoch called the Anthropocene, in recognition that humanity is what's doing this. Dr. Coyne and Hoekstra raised some interesting and concerning points about connections through which climate change and extinction can play off and exacerbate one another, the risks that we take in depending on monocultures, the enormous financial costs we bear as hidden services provided by certain ecosystems will be lost to us, and the ethics of condemning other species to extinction without batting an ethical eye. But I want to jump past that and read the last paragraph from the paper, which really drives some things home. So they say, whether or not one is moved by the aforementioned concerns, it is certain that our future is bleak if we do nothing to stem this sixth extinction. We are creating a world in which exotic diseases flourish, but natural medicinal cures are lost. A world in which carbon waste accumulates while food sources dwindle. A world of sweltering heat, failing crops, and impure water. In the end, we must accept the possibility that we ourselves are not immune to extinction. Or if we survive, perhaps only a few of us will remain, scratching out a grubby existence on a devastated planet. Global warming will seem like a secondary problem when humanity finally faces the consequences of what we've done to nature. Not just another great dying, but perhaps the greatest dying of all. Now, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists is a group that was established at the end of World War II by scientists, engineers, and other experts who created the atom bomb. They receive sobering reports like this. They sift through all the information and evaluate and prioritize the most significant threats to civilization, and then they share that information with the public. Returning to the importance of digestible stories, Inhofe's snowball was very misleading, but it was of great rhetorical value. People got it, they could see it. The doomsday clock of the Atomic Bulletin achieves the same thing minus the deception. It boils things down to an admittedly imprecise yet symbolically powerful number that instantly conveys how close we stand to disaster. On January of this year, following Trump's inauguration, the Bulletin moved the clock half a tick forward to 2.5 minutes to midnight. This is the nearest we've been to Armageddon since America and the Soviet Union detonated thermonuclear bombs. This too should give us pause. And give one last perspective on how close humanity is to putting the final nail in our collective coffin. This is Phil Torrey studies existential risk. He's an affiliate scholar at the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. Along with the threats that we've already covered, he factors in things like nuclear terrorism, nuclear war, nuclear accidents, pandemics, whether from naturally mutated bugs or genetically engineered ones that are purposefully manipulated to be more lethal or infectious, nanotechnology and artificial intelligence, which may not really register in the lay community, but for people that study, they actually see that as one of our bigger risks that we're facing. All the inherent risks of conflicting religions with their conflicting end-time scenarios, which some of them are trying to bring about. And as various technologies become more accessible, not just to state players, but to small groups or individual actors, this risk skyrockets, and it's hard to see how we can get a hold of that. So for purposes of their calculations, existential risk is defined here as either a catastrophe leading to extinction or to permanent severe deprivation where society just won't recover. And far from the 1 in a million risk that we might be facing, which I hadn't really thought about too much before reading his work and speaking to him. You just assume things will hopefully work out and you'll get through and you have time. We may not have time. Experts in this field put the risk of human extinction within this century at a staggering 19%. Martin Rees, who's a highly decorated British cosmologist and astrophysicist, he has the dubious distinction of having accepted the Templeton Prize. He puts humanity's chance of surviving the century at 50%. So to recap, we're facing multiple global threats, including but not limited to climate change, biodiversity loss, and ecosystem collapse. The most significant ones of these are primarily man-made, and many interact with one another and could possibly spark positive feedback loops that accelerate dangerous processes. The problems above, coupled with others that we haven't directly addressed, clear-cutting forests, dumping toxic chemicals into the environment, overfishing the seas, introducing invasive species, have already pushed us into the sixth great mass extinction, an event so rare that it only occurs once every 100 million years. And humanity got this done in a geological heartbeat. In making their global assessment of risk, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists surmised that we're closer than we've been to self-annihilation than at any other point in the last half century. and existential risk experts put the chance of humanity getting wiped out within the lifetime of babies being born today at somewhere between the roll of a six-sided die and the flip of a coin. Yet our government, particularly our anti-science right-wing side, continues with business as usual. So in his dystopian classic 1984, George Orwell gave his readers a not-so-subtle warning in the very first line that something was amiss. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Our clocks are striking 13 also, and we can't keep ignoring them. Noam Chomsky is a political dissident and one of the leading intellectuals in the world for decades. Had this to say about Trump, not of Trump, but of the entire Republican Party. He said, has there ever been an organization in human history that is dedicated with such commitment to the destruction of organized human life on Earth? Not that I'm aware of. Which really leads us to a question of governance. Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address in 1863, and in it he implored the living to honor the fallen by ensuring us that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And yet each and every one of those phrases flies in the face of what we now see. And despite branding ourselves as the shining city on a hill, which certainly had theocratic overtones in the beginning, last year the United States officially slipped from being classified as a full democracy to a flawed democracy. As per the Democracy Index, which rates countries based on 60 indicators measuring pluralism, civil liberties, and political culture. Can I just ask, is there a Dave Meslin here by any chance? Okay. I just found his video online. He happens to be an activist from Toronto. It seemed he might be interested. I didn't know if he'd be here, so I'd take a shot. Anyway, he pointed out in his video that what sometimes looks like political apathy, where the masses just don't care, that's often much more representative of a government that's putting up obstacles to people being involved, where the goal is to have a spectator democracy as opposed to active participation. For instance, one example he uses, if you're on a website selling shoes, you're not going to have to struggle to find the click here, buy now sign. Whereas if there's some social or political issues that you think this is important, I'd like to be involved, you might sift through 3 pages and look through the fine print and have a click here to email to get a phone number to somebody that might be able to tell you about, they're not trying to engage the public and bring them in sometimes. And so you have to ask, does the government want a vibrant participatory democracy or not? So you have to ask yourself, who is the government really for at this point? Louis Brandeis, former Supreme Court Justice, known for his integrity, for fighting against corporations and monopolies and public corruption, and for fighting in defense of freedom of speech and the right to privacy, said this of wealth disparity: we can have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both. It's pretty clear what we have these days. Right now, the richest 8 men in the world possess as much money as the poorest 3.6 billion. The richest 20 Americans have as much as the bottom 152 million Americans. And CEOs who tout, hiking yourself up by your bootstraps make more in a day than their employees make in a year often. Not to mention planned obsolescence, where they make sure that those bootstraps tear as soon as they go out of warranty. So at a certain point, wealth inequality becomes corrosive to democracy because it undercuts the idea that we're all in this working together towards shared goals. This picture was a nod to Jack and the Beanstalk, with President Theodore Roosevelt being cast by the progressives as Jack to fight the giants of Wall Street. I don't think Donald is out there fighting the Wall Street giants at this point. And Democrats weren't either. So Housing Secretary Ben Carson, who held no particular qualifications for his new job other than having supported Trump, responded to these growing levels of inequality a week or two ago by suggesting that poverty is just a state of mind to a large extent. It's really hard to see how that qualifies as acceptable leadership. Noam Chomsky takes this problem straight back to the Constitutional Convention in Requiem for the American Dream, where he quotes James Madison, who wrote, "The major concern of society has to be protection of the minority of the opulent against the majority." So we've had this conflict since the beginning. And Chomsky further notes that the disparity we see now didn't happen by chance. This comes from purposeful shifts in social and economic policy that have persisted for over 3 decades now. And most tellingly, this has been completely against the will of the people. This is not what our society has been trying to press our politicians to do. This is what's happened despite what the people want to happen. Producer and director Roger Weisberg and political satirist John Fugelsang pick up on the same thing as they go in search of the vanishing American dream. Alexis de Tocqueville had come to study the great experiment in democracy in 1831, and he was amazed by and concerned about the egalitarian spirit he'd found here, where it didn't matter somebody's background, they still had a chance to climb the ladder of economic opportunity. We're now at a point where America has less social mobility than the aristocracy that spawned it. Or in the words of George Carlin, posted on the Dream On site, it's called the American Dream because you have to be asleep to believe it. As to how we've reached a state of such bad governance, we've discussed the importance of narratives. A couple of quotes that have come down through the years and have been embraced by the GOP as gospel, from Ronald Reagan's inaugural address, which the Republicans trimmed down, to government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. And from the founder of Americans for Tax Reform, Grover Norquist, I don't want to abolish government, I simply want to reduce it to the size where I can drag it into the bathroom and drown it in a bathtub. So those storylines have set the tone, and the GOP has spent decades making our government as dysfunctional and counterproductive as possible. And the Democrats, for their part, while not nearly as vulgar and domineering, have been complicit in setting policies that primarily serve the elite. And as we've noted, at some point, simply having such lopsided levels of wealth impedes a democracy. So the question becomes, at what point do we try to do something about it? So I want you to do a thought experiment. Suppose a dike has been erected around, we'll say, Florida 50 years from now to keep back the rising sea, and you come across a hole in the dike. So like the Dutch boy that did this to save the day once, you stick your finger in that hole, and then a new hole pops up. And even as you plug that with another finger, a third arises, and then a fourth. And soon you're just one of 1,000 humanist activists spending your days plugging up holes and patching cracks. And this goes on for some time until it becomes the norm. Then one day you stumble across an underground media site, Democracy Now! And Then, and they've got a video showing footage of Blackwater/Z Services/Academy with the ship cruising about under the cover of night, its American flag proudly flapping in the wind, and Donald Jr. Jr. and Eric Prince Double Jr. are taking turns firing cannonballs off the ship at the dike. Now, plugging holes might be a crucial stopgap measure, but is this really a viable long-term strategy, or do we need to address the madmen at the helm and the process that keeps putting them there? This is a version of the trolley problem. We have to decide if you would pull the lever to divert the trolley off its current straight path so it would veer around the curve. By pulling that lever, you'd be killing one person to save 5. My understanding is that most people feel it would be ethically right to pull the lever, but they feel differently if you were up on a bridge and had to push somebody, physically push them down so they fall on the track, they get killed, and it stops the trolley and still saves the same 5 people. I think it was Sam Harris that described our feelings about those trade-offs as a moral illusion, how we see them as different. But I'm not suggesting that kind of ethical problem. I'm talking about something different. First of all, if we're really facing the possibility of extinction or some truly horrible future that's maybe just as bad, we don't have 5 people on the track. We have 8 billion people on the track by the end of the century. Or if you want to assume that 20% risk that the existential risk experts do, we have 1.6 billion people laying on the track. The other thing is, I'm not suggesting that we have to throw somebody on the track to save them. I'm not saying even trade one person to save the 1.6 billion. I'm just suggesting that we should be morally obligated to do what we can to, stop the person that's driving that trolley before he plows into everybody. So I'm going to run through some of my thoughts. There's a lot of text ones now. Our species is facing a number of potentially catastrophic threats. Current US leadership lacks the desire and/or competence to understand and address those threats. What's more, to varying degrees, both of our major political parties have become beholden to corporate interest, financial elite, and large power brokers, rather than we the people. This often leads to policies that fly in the face of the public interest, and that often leads to the parties, Democratic, Republican parties, presenting useful fictions that aren't trying to help the public understand why a policy was implemented, but they're just trying to spin that so they can capture the most votes and stay in power. When voters recognize that these narratives are propaganda and realize that they don't have a voice, that can lead to cynicism and political disengagement. When the voters don't realize that it's all propaganda and they simply buy into the misleading narratives, they can end up being duped and voting against their interests. neither of these options are good for a healthy democracy. Compounding this problem is the fact that we have a highly consolidated, corporate-owned, profit-driven media whose interests don't necessarily track with the interests of we the people. Excuse me. So what we need to have a functional democracy is a vibrant fourth estate that keeps its eye on the ball and makes sure we have accurate information on which to base our decisions. Our mainstream media didn't even cover the Dakota pipeline protest at first. This is something I had the chance to work with INR7 Rob a little bit over the last year, and he brought this to my attention at some point, saying, have you seen what's going on here? Is there somebody we can contact, try to do something? And my reaction when he was telling me about it is, well, first of all, are you sure it's not a hoax? Where do you see this, that government is releasing attack dogs or pepper spraying peaceful protesters? So first, we have to do our fact checks because there's so much misinformation out there. But it turned out it was basically right. Amy Goodman, who reports for Democracy Now!, was revealing the brutality being directed at protesters. The Attorney General of the state, in response to that, tried to prosecute her on trumped-up charges, for trespassing, and I think he had an additional charge, and these were eventually dropped. But can you imagine the stifling effect that this has on the free press when reporters who are trying to expose government misbehavior are threatened with jail? And Amy Goodman has a certain level of prominence. Now imagine what it does for all the people that don't have attorneys at their disposal. You're not going to want to speak up. It's very easy to quickly, squash people, where you're willing to take so much of a risk, but you do have to consider your family. There's other things to consider. At some point, you can shut down a free and open society. Naomi Wolf talks about this in Letter of Warning to a Young Patriot, where she points out sort of like the 10 steps that societies typically go through when closing down. She wrote this back during the Bush administration because she was seeing so many what she called echoes from the past. And it's a short book. You should read it. It's really disturbing to see how many things the U.S. has done that replicate things that we saw in fascist societies. And this was before Trump came to office, where he's right there and cut off press conferences. He just tweets directly to America with no fact checkers in the middle of it. He wants to loosen up the libel law so he can sue the New York Times for reporting bad news on him. Again, all it would take is one or two prominent people to disappear or go to jail for something they shouldn't have done, and everybody's going to shut up. Additionally, on an individual level, we have large swaths of the voting public that lack a basic understanding of critical thinking or of how science works. These are the very things that might help immunize them and our system against manipulation and empower us to try to fix our democracy. Thus, given the crises that we face and the narrowing time frame that we have to address these in, I suggest that we do the following. I think we should use the SS ashamed, and we're going to use this both as a mnemonic device and a useful metaphor. And this is kind of a nod to the fact that whereas a lot of politicians, such as Trump, think it's a virtue never apologizing, we in the reality-based community are probably pretty ashamed about the course that our government's been taking, which puts humanity at risk. So I want this to serve as sort of like a rescue boat or a tugboat that can tow our misguided ship of state in a new direction that hopefully leads us to safer waters. So the SS ashamed is an acronym for, first, our shared communities. Secular, skeptical, atheist, scientific, and humanist communities that are not identical, but have a lot of overlap and often work toward the same cause. The A is to remind us that we need to work with artists of all stripes: singers and rappers, comedians, political satirists, filmmakers, game makers, novelists, poets, painters, playwrights, and documentarians. Tombstone to Deadman and Baba Brinkman are two rappers that leap to mind. So they're hip-hop artists who rap about critical thinking, climate change, existential risk. They reach a very different audience that might sit down and read books about this. And we can work together with them and both promoting each other. These are the people that can tap into the all-important imagination that we've been talking about and craft truthful but powerful narratives that can take our themes and help make them digestible, emotionally sticky, or emotionally resonant and sticky. It's not good enough to keep talking within our own bubble where we're just talking to a relatively small group of humanists or critical thinkers or skeptics or people really into science. We need to get to the mainstream public that actually votes people into office if we're going to affect change. The M is for media. We need to partner with and or develop substantial media outlets in order to connect ourselves and the artists that we work with to that large mainstream audience. I see this as probably one of our biggest problems. Robert Reich, who was a labor secretary under Clinton and is now a very strong progressive voice, he said, he would often speak in those meetings, and he wasn't pushing for, pushing for more progressive platforms. And it's like he would speak there, but wasn't heard. And he used the reference to, if a tree falls, nobody would hear him. We need this media so it doesn't get distracted by the next shiny object that comes along. If there's an important story that we should be following, we need to have funding so there's actually reporters that go out and investigate it, and they don't just take, the PR piece that an organization puts out and no research happens, so you're just echoing it, and then you have two people with very opposite views come and shout at each other and say, hey, look at this interesting debate, and the audience walks away completely uninformed. So if we're going to make change, this is probably one of the expenses that we really need to cover. We need a real media system that can compete with corporate media. It needs to be scientifically literate, not profit-driven, and really focus on news. The E is to remind us about education, specifically epistemology. We need to provide the resources to make critical thinking and scientific literacy the norm rather than the exception. Part of this focus, the process could focus less on targeting specific beliefs at first and more just on developing sound epistemic system where people rely on evidence and logic rather than trusting in faith. Peter Boghossian, who wrote Manual for Creating Atheists and has developed street epistemology, uses this technique where it tends to be a lot less inflammatory. It doesn't provoke what they call doxastic closure, where people shut down. You say God is silly and they don't want to hear from you anymore. I think this has a lot of applications outside of just religion. So, I had this at an office I walked in, and we ended up talking about climate change somehow. And he was a climate denier, and it was just sort of getting heated. And then at some point, I took a very different tact. I was just like, I'm sure that you're trying to do the best for the world and your future generations too, and I'm curious why you feel this way. And it completely flipped the tone of the conversation. And then we had to leave, but it was just instructive that we know how psychology works a little bit. We know how people shut down. And so we need to use our understanding of psychology to make a better way to actually connect with people. And finally, the D is to remind us about engaging the democratic process. And not only doing this by grassroots activism, as we saw, I don't think it's a good long-term strategy when somebody is battering away at the dike for us to keep plugging holes. It's just not sustainable, and it's not fixing the problem. So grassroots activism is absolutely critical. I'm not trying to diminish it in any way, but I think that we should take this opportunity to run a highly qualified scientist with humanist leanings for president. I would also consider other options. You could run a humanist with very close ties and full support of the scientific communities. You could even have a conventional politician, potentially, who identifies with and works very tightly with these groups. But for right now, I want to stick with a scientist. At the same time, I think we would want them to establish a crisis-competent cabinet and to work as a shadow cabinet right now to sort of discuss new problems as they arise real time so that the American electorate could see the difference of a group motivated by critical thinking and humanism that as problems come in, they have a nuanced conversation, discuss what they might do or what other information they need to know to make an informed decision about what to do. And it's perfectly fine to say, I don't know yet, we don't have enough information, here are some things to look for. This would be a way to introduce the public to that process of good critical thinking. So again, we've harped on stories quite a bit. Donald Trump's presidential narrative that helped get him into office was that he was a good businessman, the greatest ever, no doubt. Think of the narratives that we could create, truthful ones. Lawrence Krauss, with a doomsday clock a bare 2.5 minutes from the fatal stroke of midnight, renowned theoretical physicist Lawrence Krauss announces presidential run in hopes of stopping humanity from wiping itself off the face of the planet. Jerry Coyne, as we enter the first great mass extinction in the last 65 million years, evolutionary biologist Jerry Coyne announces presidential run in hopes we can stop humanity from going the way of the dinosaurs. Michael Mann, with rising temperatures threatening to unleash mayhem across the planet, premier climate scientist Michael Mann announces presidential bid in hopes of preserving modern civilization. So these are just three that come quickly to mind. We could construct many others. And while I'm not in a position to know who might be interested, who might be well qualified, we have a lot of people in our community, we have a lot of people in this room who probably are in a position to know, and who could certainly reach out to other people in a position to know and get that kind of information. Here are a few women whose names popped up as either possible candidates or advisors just to help us figure things out, or to help figure things out. Eugenie Scott, Carolyn Porco, Rebecca Goldstein, Maxine Singer, Mary Roach, Robin Blumner, Elizabeth Loftus, Carol Tavris, Harriet Hall, Naomi Oreskes, Peggy Sandine, just to name a few. I throw that out because the first three I put are white men. We do want to think about diversity also. So again, I'm not claiming to know the right people to put forward, but I am urging us to actually make a concerted effort and give this real thought to not just, be neutral on the moving train, but to actually try to take some action that will help humanity. Bill Nye and Neil deGrasse Tyson, another couple nationally known figures. Elon Musk, a well-known billionaire who just dumped Trump for his stance on climate change. And as a further note, while the president of the United States has to be, American, that doesn't mean that other prominent secular scientists like Richard Dawkins, Stephen Hawking, NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies Director Gavin Schmidt, Steven Pinker. There are so many people that so many of you as premier, artists, scientists could reach out to, where we could really paint the picture that this isn't just us running, one scientist guy. This is the scientific world, the premier scientists saying, this is a problem, the type of government you have in America. We want to work with you, not against you. We can generate such a powerful narrative and such a powerful story to really capture the imagination and make this where it's, I worry that people are going to just assume this is implausible. And so that's one of the things I want to do is help us climb the gentler slopes, like going up Mount Improbable, to see that maybe this isn't such a far-fetched idea. Bernie Sanders, again, as I mentioned, was very much a humanist. And you remember his suggestion was that God means we're all in this together. He also had the Democratic Socialist label to boot. But his egalitarian and empathetic call for universal health care, living wage, free or affordable college were incredibly popular with the voters. I don't think having a scientific humanist, that it would be a stretch to say the people would support you. If we have, so some of the things that we need to counter, I'm just trying to remember my organization here. Let's see if I get to this in a little bit. Well, I'll just say that we really do need that media. We need a separate, well-funded source that if we are trying to get a message out that is realistic and would help society, that it can't be squashed by corporate interest, basically. So that will mean that we actually need funding, substantial funding, to develop a media presence. So two points on that. Bernie Sanders raised $230 million for the primary, 2/3 of that from small donors, practically matching the Democratic machine, dollar for dollar and stride for stride. So with this kind of story that would appeal to a lot of people, and again, that happens to be true, that we can defend it, that every time they try to throw dirt at it, you can have the leading scientists of the world say, no, actually they're right, and this is why. And if we have a media that actually can keep that in public view and not let people, the news cycle goes and suddenly it's out of mind, again, it's a very commanding narrative. The second point is that Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, both non-believers and two of the richest men on the planet, in 2010, they started the Giving Pledge, inviting other wealthy philanthropists to pledge to give at least half of their wealth away before they died or upon their death. There are now 158 signatories, and their pledges amount to $365 billion. These are phenomenally rich people who want to use their wealth to change the world. And so while Donald Trump is thrashing about in the Oval Office, and given the host of civilizational threats that we just discussed, I think that we could make a compelling case to some of these leaders that if they can help us build the infrastructure, we could potentially change democracy and really alter the course of the world for the better, that it's not just a pipe dream. So I want to close with this. This shows a hero of Dr. Krauss's book, Adam, and he's comforting his fellow Adams. He's reassuring them, don't worry, fellow Adams, this will all be fine. regardless of what happens to humanity, we're going to be okay. So, thank you.